Hello, and welcome to Fatima's AP European History. Today we'll be discussing both imperialism and World War I. So let's get going, shall we? Okay, so imperialism. Before we can discuss imperialism, we need to rewind a bit to when Spain and Portugal began the first sustained European quest for colonies in the 15th century. Their version of imperialism, or Old Imperialism as we now call it, was all about trade. Their imperialism entailed the economic exploitation and control, informal or formal, over territories. Britain provided the classical case. The British insisted on free trade, an open market that would allow English merchants to sell goods without tariff restrictions and return home with luxury products for the home market. European traders had established port facilities and made agreements with local rulers allowing them to trade freely. The difference with new imperialism is that European powers now want direct control over their colonies. Another thing is that relatively few Europeans had settled permanently in Africa or Southeast Asia, which were considered daunting, expensive, and a dangerous challenge in the past. Despite their relative wealth and power, European imperial states lacked the resources for complete conquest and control. Moreover, public opinion at home did not yet support massive colonial undertakings. But something big happened at the turn of the 18th century. The Second Industrial Revolution. Oh yeah. The Industrial Revolution made the great powers hungry for new sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. The enormous resources generated by large-scale industrialization and the rapid spread of nationalism fueled the new imperialism. Despite rivalries between the powers, for during this period they were not involved in wars with one another, allowing them to concentrate their energies and resources on imperial expansion, which new technological advances facilitated. Imperial powers, Britain, France, and Germany, no longer looked to preserve the balance of power on the continent, but rather to extend what each considered its national interests. So what caused imperialism? Well, industrialists sought new markets and new materials. That's for certain. Like old imperialism, missionary work still played a vital role in colonial acquisitions. There was definitely a need and an emphasis on spreading Christianity in Africa and Asia. Militarism and the building of one's naval bases to protect one's interests against other European powers. And my favorite, and I think the most important, nationalism and the idea of social Darwinism. Europeans thought they were better than their less civilized colonial counterparts. They rationalized their conquest of weak countries by the Darwinist ideology of survival of the fittest and white man's burden, which preached that superior Westerners had the obligation to bring their culture to uncivilized peoples in developing or third world countries. So how were the countries divided, and how was it decided? In the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, the rules for imperialism in Africa were established. Some of the rules for conquest of Africa included that no imperial power could claim territory unless it effectively controlled that territory, and slavery was to be terminated. It was organized and sponsored by German Chancellor Bismarck. In order for a nation to claim a territory, they had to prove that they established sufficient authority in a territory to protect existing rights, such as freedom of trade and transit. This set off the mad dash that left every square inch of Africa divided among the European powers, with the exception of Ethiopia and the small state of Liberia. The Berlin Conference sought to establish mandates to signify that a European power accepted its right to govern a territory and to provide, in principle, for the welfare of its backward people. It also aimed to prevent international conflicts between European nations over the issue of imperialism. The Congress coincided with Germany's rise as an imperial power and its desire to play Britain and France off each other. The Berlin Conference came to represent the mad desire for European powers to be seen on the global scale. Okay, so now we know the causes and how territories were divided. What about who got who in this, and what were the main events? Britain was well known for its acquisition of Egypt and pretty much the majority of Africa, as well as India. France worked hard to get Morocco in its fight against Germany in the Moroccan crisis, and the rest of Africa was split between France, Germany, Belgium, and Italy. So the events you must know. India's Sepoy Mutiny. So this was the sepoys, Indian troops in the British Army. They were angry at the British policy of taking direct control over Indian states, whose princes died without heirs. They were also angry at Britain's use of animal fat to grease rifle cartridges, which was sacrilegious to both Muslim and Hindu faiths. Besides this, the sepoys were experiencing low pay and resentment of British officers. Confronted with British unyieldingness, the sepoys rebelled over a wide area beginning near Delhi and killing numbers of British women and children. They were supported by local elites, particularly those who saw increased British authority to be a threat to Islam in areas of that religion. An extensive military campaign followed, involving almost 200,000 British and Indian soldiers. British authorities hanged rebels and burned a number of villages. The Opium Wars. Britain, as per normal, wants free trade in China to expand its realm of influence, but the Chinese are getting hooked on opium, which is a kind of drug, and the government is trying to put a stop to this. So they limit all trade with foreigners. In order to put an end to this, Britain sends their navy to Canton to force China to surrender. British forces occupy Shanghai, and by the Treaty of Nanking that followed in 1842, China was forced to establish a number of treaty ports open to British trade, including Canton and Shanghai, and it was required to grant Britain formal authority over Hong Kong. British residents in China were immune from Chinese law. In the Second Opium War, a combined British and French army forced China to open 6 more British and French trade indefinitely. So China's Boxer Rebellion. In northern China, many Chinese resented the foreigners. A lot of them blamed the floods and drought, events that were also taken to mean that the ruling dynasty was at its end. This was basically a secret, anti-foreign, and nationalist society that was better known as the Boxers. In the 1900s, the Boxers rebelled against Western domination. Many of the Boxers believed they were immune to foreign bullets. The targets of their wrath were missionaries who sought to convert the Chinese, railroads that took work away from Chinese transporters, foreign merchants who flooded the Chinese markets with cheap textiles, bringing unemployment to the local population, and foreign soldiers who often mistreated the Chinese. In 1900, the Boxers attacked Europeans, Americans, and Chinese Christians in Shandong province. These attacks spread quickly to the imperial capital and other parts of northern China. After the Boxers killed several hundred foreign devils, the British, Russian, German, French, Japanese, and American troops put down the rebellion. Their governments assessed the Chinese government a crushing indemnity of 67.5 million pounds. Okay, so that is pretty much imperialism. Now let's go on to World War I. So we all know what caused World War I. It all started with nationalism. People are patriotic and they are overjoyed with nationalist feeling that their country is the best and it should conquer and rule all. In fact, it's so good it should rule the world. This feeling of love for the country and the aim to build a stronger nation prompted leaders to increase their military. And so that is exactly what happened. Britain, Germany, and Russia's military increased, which they thought, well, now I have an awesome military, let's go conquer people. And so they did. Countries imperialized weaker ones, and this generated jealousy. When one European power saw another European power gaining control, they became competitive, and it all came down to one thing: alliances. The two opposing forces were the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. France and Germany hated each other because of their whole Alsace-Lorraine spiel. Germany and Austria-Hungary hated Russia because Russia was trying to gain control in the Balkans, which is where Austria dominated. Britain and Germany were involved in their whole military arms race. So this is pretty much how the alliances came to be. Instead of enveloping yourself in the details of the war, try and concentrate yourself to the consequences of war for the home front, for Russia, and for Europe. So for the home front, when it became clear that the war would not be over quickly, governments mobilized all human and industrial resources in order to wage total war. Governments tightly controlled the news and used propaganda to rally public morale and arouse hatred of the enemy. As more and more men went to war, millions of women replaced them in factories, which marked the very first time that the employment of women was essential for a sustained war effort. Women gained more rights, such as suffrage in Britain, in 1918, which is awesome. For Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is basically when Russia went out of the war, and they had to give one-third of Russia to Germany for doing so. Russia, as we know it, were off fighting a civil war as the Bolsheviks gained increasing dominance, and Vladimir Lenin, he did his thing, and the Tsar became obsolete. For Europe, World War I changed Europe forever. Germany acknowledged Wilson's 14 points, and the war ended with an armistice. Germany was to blame for starting the war, and they had to pay almost $33 billion in reparations. At the Paris Peace Conference, the victors, which, if you didn't know, were the Allies, established a framework for future international relations based on Wilson's League of Nations. A new map of Europe was drawn. Austria-Hungary was dissolved and the Habsburg monarchy eliminated. Austria and Hungary became separate states. In addition, territories from Austria-Hungary were given to the newly created states of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Serbs dominated Yugoslavia and found land, and the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania emerged from the Tsarist Empire. World War I created a legacy of bitterness between both the victors and the defeated, which led to the Second World War in just 20 years. Thank you so much. That was both Imperialism and World War I. Have a nice day.